let's go ahead and begin looking at a new lesson. Things to think about when creating an artwork is how can we use text, stencils, and repetition to create work. Now, you can see the title of this says all of these things, but you don't necessarily need to use all of these ideas in your artwork. I just wanted to give you some options and to think about how you can repeat imagery or manipulate imagery to create meaning. So we are going to be using watercolor, but if you're watching this and you're choosing another media, you would want to be able to think about how the qualities of your media, in our case watercolor, could be manipulated to represent value, color, space, and how those techniques could be used to create that meaning. So you didn't necessarily need to repeat your imagery, but what kind of effects could you use to create meaning? So for my class, you might want to use some stencils. So you can purchase stencils, you can make stencils, you can do a combination of the two, and so you have many options. And then here's some different examples of artworks that were made with stencils. And later we'll actually get into how we're going to make those, but not in this video. So what I wanted to do was to show you some artworks that can be for some inspiration. But I want you to keep in mind that this is not necessarily specific to our media or even specific to our lesson. We really just want to focus on how artists have incorporated letters, numbers, text, words, stencils into their artwork. So a really good example of someone who did this kind of early on is Jasper Johns. And he did a lot of artworks based on numbers and letters. And he would pull imagery from his childhood, or at least that's what I was told. And so he would use bright colors, he would use numbers and letters, things that might be in his classroom when he was little, or on like a chalkboard. But when you are thinking about how to use your imagery, you might want to be thinking about the intensity of color and its value. So how does the image quality change? But also, how could your value and intensity of your color change your meaning? Is the meaning different when it's bright, when it's muted, or when it lacks any color at all? Like, how does that change the meaning of the numbers that you see in the artworks? You can think about how you're going to organize your work. Are you going to organize your work into rows? Are you going to superimpose them on top so they're overlapped? This is the closest one I could find to watercolor. I think it's probably ink. You can use words. Here's another Jasper Johns. Mel Buckner is a contemporary artist who uses text. And so here is his billboard. So think about how the repetition of the word creates meaning, right? So here he could have wrote just blah, but he chose to keep repeating blah, 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 over and over again. So how does the setting of the billboard and how does the text and the repetition of the text create meaning? Here's another example of his. So when we start to repeat a word over and over again, we might want to think about, does that word start to lose meaning? Maybe not in this artwork, maybe it lost meaning in the previous, but have you ever repeated a word over and over and over again, and after a while it doesn't sound right, or it kind of loses its meaning? There's actually a word for that, semantic saturation, which is a phenomenon where you repeat a word and it temporarily loses meaning to the viewer. So think about how you can repeat the words to create meaning. You can use phrases, quotes, poetry, lyrics. Here are some artists that use words, so feel free to use this hyperlink to check out some artists who use text. Some of those are people like Jenny Holzer. She put this in Las Vegas. So think about how that location and that words create meaning based on the location and the media that she chose. Here's another example of her work called Pile. Notice how it's organized. Now we're not going to be able to organize our information in a corner, but think about how she organizes those into piles, and think about the words that she's repeating: nameless, cruel, forces. Why did she choose a pile? Why did she choose to use red, right? And why is that red seen through the text? How does the arrangement and organization of the words create meaning, right? Why are some of the text in color and why are some of them in black and white? Sorry, I lost the name of the artist here. For some reason, it's gone. Right? Here's Area Environments, which is a graphic design company who uses text to overlap on top of each other. This is Karen Vogel. Notice how she incorporates the imagery of the stencil in her artwork. Now, I'm not going to let you collage your stencils into it, but how can you make it look like it's a stencil? What kind of watercolor techniques can you use to create kind of this layered overlapping effect? So besides numbers and letters, you can also use imagery. So maybe you want to choose symbols, icons to create meaning. Here's the very famous diptych of Maryland by Andy Warhol. Notice how he uses color, right? On the right side, he's using bright artificial color to kind of represent her persona, right? Marilyn Monroe wasn't a real person, it was a persona. And then on the right side, we have, after her death, imagery that kind of fades. Why did he choose to make it fade? Why did he take away the color? Does that have symbolic meaning, right? Why does it look like it's printed like a newspaper? When you're organizing your space, it doesn't have to be in perfect rows like you see in the Maryland. What if you alter the spacing? Right? Think about how your symbols can create meaning. So for my students, this was for a sketchbook assignment I did for a class that I took, but I used stenciling for the text, but also for the imagery. So I would not call this like a finished artwork. This is more like a journal entry. An artist that's probably really well known for his stencil work is the infamous artist Banksy. So you probably have noticed what he will do is draw these images and make stencils and then use photocopies to blow them up and then cut out the stencil. So you can use that technique too. You can make multiple stencils of the same thing and you can just blow it up on a copy machine or print it out different sizes. You can even buy yourself a Banksy stencil if you want to. For some reason, they're selling them on Etsy. I don't know if it's him or not, right? And then here's some student and teacher examples. So here we have numbers superimposed on top of each other. This is colored pencil and watercolor. Here's my example of self-care. My example of more. This is a watercolor example from last semester of leaves. I think this is an artist example, but here's a student example. We traced leaves. So you could trace real leaves or trace fake leaves. These are stencils I made out of gears. So I had 3 different sizes of stencils that I made. Here's some uses of stenciling in symbols that you might recognize. We'll work not to make it too cheesy. Here is a stencil painting that I made based on a cookie cutter. So I actually made a stencil from a cookie cutter, but if you had something like a stencil, you could trace that. And then these are assignments done by past students with this lesson in particular. Why is the fish going the different direction? Why is the fish different color? Right? So that kind of ends the artist inspiration. I just want to let you know that in the rest of the PowerPoint, there's basically ways for you to plan. So there is a worksheet and brainstorm to help you kind of figure out what you want to do. So do you want to use words, letters, and numbers? Or do you want to use symbols and icons and appropriation? So how are you going to alter the imagery? Either way, right? I want you to think about what would happen if you repeat the words. How does that change the meaning? What kind of watercolor techniques could you use to create meaning, right? So even if you're not going to repeat the imagery, what are you going to do to it through color and technique? You might have to, you'll definitely have to think about how you're going to organize your visual space. So does it make sense to sketch on sketch paper? Notice that I've incorporated borders, right? Vertical or horizontal. It could also be square, right? You could use small stencils and trace imagery to get your sketches out, but you don't have to. You could lay actual objects on top of a piece of paper and play with the arrangement like I did for last fall's example of this. You can use tracing paper. So tracing paper can be used to make a stencil or at least to plan your imagery, because you can always go back and overlap tracing paper on top of tracing paper to think about what that looks like. Here's some demos on how to make stencils. Photopea.com is free. And so most remote students will probably want to use this. But then here's also a Photoshop demo if you have that at home. And then we're going to want to start to plan out our color. So thinking about resources that we have, like our watercolor palettes, our glaze charts, which combination of colors will look good together. We'll want to make a sample. When I'm choosing colors, there's different ways that I kind of gain inspiration. Some colors obviously have symbolic meaning. You know, red can be really violent or really energetic or really intense, but you might also think about color combinations from color schemes. You might get your color from objects. You might get your color from other artworks. You could even get your colors based on a photo that you enjoy. So this is like a fall image that or not fall image, an image I took at dusk when I was on a walk last summer, and I really love the color combinations. And then notice the colors are in a painting underneath. Right. So let's go ahead and end there and try to make sure that you take some time, really ruminate, think about what it is that you want to convey through your messaging.